Little House Live Day 29. As you can see, it's already fan time in this house. And I've been really busy today, so I'm just gonna let me say hi to everybody. See who all is here. Let's pop out the chat. I'm not unlisted or anything, right? Okay, because I had it unlisted at first so that I could change things around. And let me pop that out and say hi to Alexis Waller and Patricia Carson. Here's Johnny and Granny Frammy. Is that everybody that's here? I didn't think so. All right. Again, I reiterate. Well, I mean, if you're going to watch this in replay, you know most of this book is a fictionalized account of stories that she heard because when they were actually in Indian territory, she was only 18 months old. So I'm pretty sure some of these stories, you remember in Little House in the Big Woods, they were laying in bed and they were listening to the folks talk and tell the stories. How do you think they remember this stuff, right? Hey, Aldo, how's it going? Rosie Slade, D-Dup, Granny Frammy. Yeah, please be careful. Nightbot. Nightbot, you can't talk to me in all caps. And you got to be careful because it's basically for children, okay? But it's not. There may be children here, so you got to be careful. Nightbot is going to be very severe, all right? So we're on chapter 10. A roof and a floor. Everybody ready? Does everybody got their yeah, see? Sorry. Yeah, it's just it's not that great. It really isn't. So, I have to change my glasses. Put on my bifocals. I am stubbornly resisting trifocals. Okay. All day long, every day, Laura and Mary were busy. When the dishes were washed and the beds made, there was always plenty to do and to see and to listen to. They hunted for birds' nests in the tall grass, and when they found them, the mother birds squawked and scolded. Sometimes they touched a nest gently, and all in an instant, a nest full of downiness became a nest full of wide gaping beaks. Should never ever do that if there's any children watching. You touch that nest with your body at all, and she may abandon them because you've found them. If you want to see the babies, you touch the branch below, right? Became a nest full of wide gaping beaks, hungrily squawking. Then the mother bird scolded like anything, and Mary and Laura quietly went away because they did not want to worry her too much. In the tall grass, they lay still as mice and watched the flocks of little prairie chickens running and pecking around their anxiously clucking. Oh my goodness. Please forgive me. It's been a really busy day. In the tall grass, they lay still as mice and watched flocks of little prairie chickens running and pecking around their anxiously clucking smooth brown mothers. That's a pretty good picture of what a prairie hen looks like, folks. They're kind of like a prairie partridge. They watched the striped snakes rippling between the grass stems or lying so still that only their tiny flickering tongues and glittering eyes showed that they were still alive. They were garter snakes and would not hurt anybody, but Laura and Mary did not touch them. Ma said snakes were best left alone because some snakes would bite and it was better to be safe than sorry. And sometimes there'd be a great gray rabbit so still in the lights and shadows of a grass clump that you were near enough to touch him before you saw him. And then if you were very quiet, you might stand a long time looking at him. His round eyes stared at yours without meaning anything. His nose wiggled and sunlight was rosy through his long ears that had delicate veins running. delicate veins in them, and the softest short fur on their outsides. The rest of his fur was so thick and soft that at last you couldn't help trying very carefully to touch it. Then he was gone in a flash, and the space where he had been sitting was hollowed smooth and still warm from his warm behind. All the time, of course, Laura or Mary was minding baby Carrie, except when she had her afternoon nap. Then they sat and soaked in the sunshine and the wind until Laura forgot that the baby was sleeping. She jumped up and ran and shouted till Ma came to the door and said, "Dear me, Laura, must you yell like an Indian?" "I declare," Ma said, "if you girls aren't getting to look like Indians. Can I never teach you to keep your sunbonnets on?" Pa was up on the house wall beginning the roof. He looked down at them and laughed. "One little Indian, two little Indian, three little Indians," he sang softly. "No, only two." "You make three," Mary said to him. "You're brown too." "But you aren't little, Pa," said Laura. "Pa, when are we going to see a papoose?" "Goodness, Ma exclaimed. "What do you want to see an Indian baby for? Put your sunbonnet on now and forget such nonsense." Excuse me. Laura's sunbonnet hung down her back. She pulled it up by its strings, and its sides came up past her cheeks. When her sunbonnet was on, she could only see what was in front of her, and that was why she was always pushing it back and letting it hang by its strings tied around her throat. She put her sunbonnet on when Ma told her to, but she did not forget about the papoose. This was Indian country, and she didn't know why she didn't see Indians. She knew she would see them sometime, though. Pa said so, but she was getting tired of waiting. Pa had taken the canvas wagon top off of the house, and now he was ready to put the roof on. For days and days, he had been hauling logs from the creek bottoms and splitting them into thin, long slabs. Piles of slabs lay all around the house, and slabs stood against it. "Come out of the house, Caroline," he said. "I don't want to risk anything falling on you or Carrie." Wait, Charles, till I put away the China shepherdess," Ma answered. In a minute, she came out with a quilt in her mending and baby Carrie. She spread the quilt on the shady grass by the stable and sat there to do her mending and watch Carrie play. Pa reached down and pulled up a slab. He laid it across the ends of the sapling rafters. Its edge stuck out beyond the wall. Then Pa put some nails in his mouth and took his hammer out of his belt, and he began to nail the slab to the rafters. Mr. Edwards had lent him the nails. They had met in the woods, where they were both chopping down trees, and Mr. Edwards had insisted that Pa borrow the nails for the roof. "That's what I call a good neighbor," Pa said, when he told Ma about it. "Yes, yes," said Ma, "but I don't like to be beholden, not even to the best of neighbors." "Nor I," Pa replied. "I've never been beholden to any man yet, and I never will be. But neighborliness is another matter, and I'll pay him back every nail as soon as I can make the trip to Independence." Now Pa carefully took the nails one by one from his mouth, and with ringing blows of the hammer, he drove them into the slab. It was much quicker than drilling holes and whittling pegs and driving them into the holes. But every now and then a nail sprang away from the tough oak when the hammer hit it, and if Pa was not holding it firmly, it went sailing through the air. Then Mary and Laura watched it fall, and they searched in the grass till they found it. Sometimes it was bent. Then Pa carefully pounded it straight again. It would never do to lose or waste a nail. When Pa had nailed down 2 slabs, he got up on them. He laid and nailed down more slabs, all the way up to the top of the rafters. The edge of each slab lapped over the edge of the slab below it. Then he began again on the roof side of the house. Then he began again on the other side of the house, and he laid the roof all the way up that side. A little crack was left between the highest slabs. So Pa made a little trough of 2 slabs, and he nailed his trough firmly upside down over the crack. The roof was done. The house was darker than it had been because no light came through the slabs. There was not one single crack that could let rain come in. I would imagine you would have to really overlap them like almost halfway down the board before, because that's raw wood that he has split away from a fresh cut tree, and it's going to shrink, right? So that's what I would be thinking. Okay. You've done a splendid job, Charles, Ma said, and I'm thankful to have a good roof over my head. You shall have furniture, too, as fine as I can make it, Pa replied. I'll make a bedstead as soon as the floor is laid. He began again to haul logs. Day after day he hauled logs. He did not even stop hauling logs to go hunting. He took his gun on the wagon and brought back at night whatever meat he had shot from the wagon seat. When he had hauled enough logs to make the floor, he began to split them. He split each log straight down the middle. Laura liked to sit on the woodpile and watch him. Sounds like me with my dad when I was a kid. First, with a mighty blow of his axe, he split the butt of the log. Into the crack, he slipped the thin edge of an iron wedge. Then he wrenched the axe out of the log, and he drove the wedge deeper into the crack. The tough wood split a little farther. All the way up the log, Pa fought that tough oak. He struck with his axe into the crack. He drove blocks of wood into it and moved the iron wedge higher. Little by little, he followed the crack up the log. He swung the axe high and brought it down with a great swing and a grunt from his chest. Ugh! The axe whizzed and struck. Plong! It always struck exactly where Pa wanted it to. At last, with a tearing, cracking sound, the whole log split. Its 2 halves lay on the ground, showing the tree's pale insides, and the darker streak up its middle. Then Pa wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a fresh grip on the axe, and he tackled another log. One day the last log was split, and next morning Pa began to lay the floor. He dragged the logs into the house and laid them one by one, flat side up. With his spade, he scraped the ground underneath and fitted the round side of the log firmly down into it. With his axe, he trimmed away the edge of the bark and cut the wood straight so that each log fitted next against the next, with hardly a crack between them. Then he took the head of the axe in his hand, and with little careful blows, he smoothed the wood. He squinted along the log to see that the surface was straight and true. He took off last little bits here and there, and finally he ran his hand over the smoothness and nodded. Not a splinter, he said. That'll be all right for little bare feet to run over. He left that log fitted into its place and dragged in another. When it came to the fireplace, he used shorter logs. He left a space of bare earth for a hearth, so that when the sparks or coals popped out of the fire, they would not burn the floor. One day, the floor was done. It was smooth and firm and hard, and a good floor of solid oak that would last, Pa said, forever. You can't beat a good punch-in floor, he said. And Ma said she was glad to be up off the dirt. She put the little China woman on the mantel shelf and spread a red check cloth on the table. There, she said, now we're living like civilized folks again. After that, Pa filled the cracks in the walls. He drove thin strips of wood into them and plastered them well with mud, filling every chink. That's a good job, Ma said. That chinking will keep out the wind no matter how hard it blows. Pa stopped whistling to smile at her. He slapped the last bit of mud between the logs and smoothed it and set down the bucket, and at last the house was finished. He didn't say whether he did the mud on the inside or the outside. I would think he would do it on the inside to keep it dry, right? Like the heat from the fireplace bake it. At last the house was finished. I wish we had glass for the windows, Pa said. We don't need glass, Charles, said Ma. Just the same, if I do well with my hunting and trapping this winter, I'm going to get some glass in Independence next spring. And Pa said, hang the expense. Glass windows would be nice if we can afford them, Ma said, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. They were all happy that night. The fire on the hearth was pleasant, for on the high prairie even the summer nights were cool. The red check cloth was on the table, and the little china woman glimmered on the mantel shelf. And the new floor was golden in the flickering firelight. Outside, the night was large and full of stars. Pa sat for a long time in the doorway and played his fiddle and sang to Ma and Mary and Laura in the house and into the starry night outside. I can't help it if I forget it. The reason I talk when thoughts come to my head is because I'll forget what I'm thinking about by the end of the chapter. So I hope you don't mind that. Ma is easy to please, but that by the time they make it to De Smet, she puts her foot down and says, "Nuh-uh, I ain't moving again." All right, shall we read Indians in the House? Do I get a yay or a nay on that? I got time, right? It's only been uh-oh. Hang on. Pages are starting to fall out of this poor old book. I've read it so many times. I'm going to have to get a new set. Hang on a second here. Where's the tape? Good heavens. There it is. All right. All right. Chapter 11. Indians in the House. Early one morning, Pa took his gun and went hunting. He had meant to make the bedstead that day. He had brought in slabs when Ma said she had no meat for dinner. So he stood the slabs against the wall and took down his gun. Jack wanted to go hunting too. His eyes begged Pa to take him, and his whines came up from his chest and quivered in his throat till Laura almost cried with him. But Pa chained him to the stable. Now remember, folks, Jack is fiction. When they moved out of the little house in the big woods, they left their dog, Wolf, behind. Remember that, okay? No, Jack, Pa said. You must stay here and guard the place. Then he said to Mary and Laura, his eyes begged Pa to take him, and whines came up from his chest and quivered in his throat till Laura almost cried with him. But Pa chained him to the stable. No, Jack, Pa said. You must stay here and guard the place. Then he said to Mary and Laura, don't let him loose, girls. Can you imagine chaining the indignity to the dog of chaining him after walking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, loose and free, following them when they left him behind? You know what I mean? But the indignity of chaining him up. I would have I'm sorry. I mean, Gracie's been used to it, but don't let him loose, girls. Poor Jack lay down. It was a disgrace to be chained, and he felt it deeply. Sorry, I should have read the next line. He turned his head from Pa and would not watch him go away with the gun on his shoulder. Pa went farther and farther away till the prairie swallowed him and he was gone. Laura tried to comfort Jack, but he would not be comforted. The more he thought about the chain, the worse he felt. Laura tried to cheer him up and to frisk and play. He only grew more sullen. Both Mary and Laura felt they would not leave Jack while he was so unhappy. So all that morning they stayed by the stable. They stroked Jack's smooth, brindled head. Oh, my pages are falling out. and around his ears and told him how sorry they were he must be chained. He lapped their hands a little bit, but he was very sad and angry. His head was on Laura's knee, and she was talking to him, when suddenly he stood up and growled a fierce, deep growl. Arrgh. The hair on his neck stood straight up, and his eyes glared red. Laura was frightened. Jack had never growled at her before. Then she looked over her shoulder where Jack was looking, and she saw two naked wild men coming one behind the other on the Indian trail. "Mary, look!" she cried. Mary looked and saw them too. They were tall, thin, fierce-looking men. Their skin was brownish red. Their heads seemed to go up to a peak, and the peak was a tuft of hair that stood straight up on end in feathers. Their eyes were black and still and glittering, like snakes' eyes. They came closer and closer. Then they went out of sight on the other side of the house. Laura's head turned, and so did Mary's, and they looked at the place where those terrible men would appear when they came past the house. "Indians," whispered Mary. Laura was shivery. There was a queer feeling in the middle, and in the bones. There was a queer feeling in her middle, and the bones in her legs felt weak. She wanted to sit down, but she stood and looked and waited for those Indians to come out from beyond the house. The Indians did not do that. All this time, Jack had been growling. Now he stopped growling, and he was lunging against the chain. His eyes were red, and his lips curled back, and all the hair on his neck was bristling. He bounded and bounded, clear off the ground, trying to get loose from the chain. Laura was glad that the chain kept him right there with her. Excuse me, I have to put another piece of tape on. The joys of live reading. Shoot. Oh well, that'll have to hold it for now. All this time, Jack had been growling. Oh no, we read that. Okay. "Jack's here," she whispered to Mary. "Jack won't let them hurt us. We'll be safe and stay close to Jack." "House with Mom, Carrie." Then Laura began to shake all over. She knew she must do something. She did not know what those Indians were doing to Ma and baby Carrie. So there was no sound at all from the house. "What are they doing to Ma?" she screamed in a whisper. "Oh, I don't know," Mary whispered. "I'm going to let Jack loose," Laura whispered hoarsely. "Jack will kill them." "Pa said not to," Mary answered. They were too scared to speak out loud. They put their heads together and watched the house and whispered. "He didn't know Indians would come, though," Laura said. "He said not to let Jack loose." Mary was almost crying. Laura thought of little baby Carrie and Ma shut in the house with those Indians. She said, "I'm going to help Ma." She ran 2 steps, walked a step, and then turned and flew back to Jack. She clutched him wildly and hung onto his strong, panting neck. Jack wouldn't let anything hurt her. "We mustn't leave Ma there alone. We mustn't leave Ma in there alone," Mary whispered. She stood still and trembled. Mary would never move when she was frightened. Forgive me, folks. These pages fall out and I'll never find them again. Mary could never move when she was frightened. Laura hid her face against Jack and held onto him tightly. Then she made her arms let go. Her hands balled into fists, her eyes shut tight, and she ran towards the house as fast as she could run. She stumbled and fell down, and her eyes popped open. She was up again and running before she could think. Mary was close behind her. They came to the door. It was open, and they slipped into the house without a sound. The naked wild men stood by the fireplace. Ma was bending over the fire, cooking something. Carrie clung to Ma's skirts with both hands, and her head was hidden in the folds. Laura ran towards Ma, but just as she reached the hearth, she smelled a horribly bad smell, and she looked up at the Indians. Quick as a flash, she ducked behind the long, narrow slab that leaned against the wall. The slab was just wide enough to cover both her eyes. If she held her head perfectly still and pressed her nose against the slab, she couldn't see the Indians. And she felt safer. But she couldn't help moving her head just a little so that one eye peeped out and she could see the wild men. First, she saw their leather moccasins, then their stringy, bare, red-brown legs all the way up. Around their waists, each one of them wore a leather thong, and the furry skin of a small animal hung down in front. The fur was striped black and white, and now Laura knew what made the smell. The skins were fresh skunk skins. A knife like Pa's hunting knife and a hatchet like Pa's hatchet were stuck into each skunk skin. The Indians' ribs made little ridges up their bare sides. Their arms were folded on their chests. At last, Laura looked again at their faces, and she dodged quickly behind the slab. Their faces were bold and fierce and terrible. Their black eyes glittered. High on their foreheads and above their ears, where the hair grows, these wild men had no hair. But on top of their heads, a tuft of hair stood straight up. It was wound round and round with string, and feathers were stuck in it. Do you know why? Because when your hair is long, it can be a weapon in a fight. Somebody grab you by your hair. When Laura peeked out from the middle slab again, both Indians were looking straight at her. Her heart jumped into her throat and choked with its pounding. Two black eyes glittered down into her eyes. The Indian did not move. Not one muscle of his face moved. Only his eyes shone and sparkled at her. Laura didn't move either. She didn't even breathe. The Indian made two short, harsh sounds in his throat. The other Indian made one sound like, ha! Laura hid her eyes again behind the slab. She heard Ma take the cover off the bake oven. She heard the Indians squat down to the hearth. After a while, she heard them eating. Laura peeked and hid and peeked again, while the Indians ate the cornbread that Ma baked. They ate every last morsel of it and even picked up the crumbs from the hearth. Ma stood and watched them and stroked baby Carrie's head. Mary stood close behind Ma and held onto her sleeve. Faintly, Laura heard Jack's chain rattling. Jack was still trying to get loose. When every crumb of the cornbread was gone, the Indians rose up. The skunk smell was stronger when they moved. One of them made harsh sounds in his throat again. Ma looked at him with big eyes. She did not say anything. The Indian turned around, the other Indian turned too, and they walked across the floor and out through the door. Their feet made no sound at all. Ma sighed a long, long sigh. She hugged Laura tight in one arm and Mary tight in the other. And through the window, they watched those Indians going away, one behind the other on the dim trail toward the west. Then Ma sat down on the bed and hugged Laura and Mary tighter and trembled. She looked sick. "Do you feel sick, Ma?" Mary asked her. "No," said Ma. "I'm just thankful they're gone." Laura wrinkled her nose and said, "They smell awful." "That was the skunk skins they wore," Ma said. Then they told her how they had left Jack and come into the house because they were afraid the Indians would hurt her and baby Carrie. Ma said they were very brave little girls. I would have told them they should have stayed where they were. "Now we must get dinner," she said. "Pa will be here soon, and we must have dinner ready for him. Mary, bring me some wood. Laura, you may set the table." You notice how she's getting busy just to distract them? Ma rolled up her sleeves and washed her hands and mixed cornbread, while Mary brought the wood and Laura set the table. She set a tin plate and knife and fork and cup for Pa, and the same for Ma, with Carrie's tin little cup beside Ma's. And she set tin plates and knives and forks for her and Mary, but only their one cup, between the plates. Ma made the cornmeal and water into 2 thin loaves. She shaped each in a half circle. She laid the loaves with their straight sides together in the bake oven, and she pressed her hand flat on top of each loaf. Pa always said he did not ask any other sweetening when Ma put prints of her hands on the loaves. Romantic good for nothing. Laura had hardly set the table when Pa was there. He left a big rabbit and 2 prairie hens outside the door, and stepped in and laid his gun on its pegs. Laura and Mary ran and clutched him, both talking at once. "What's all this? What's all this?" he said, rumpling her hair. "Indians? So you've seen Indians at last, have you, Laura?" I noticed they have a camp in the little valley west of here. Did the Indians come to the house, Caroline?" "Yes, Charles, 2 of them," Ma said. "I'm sorry, but they took all your tobacco, and they ate a lot of cornbread. They pointed to the cornmeal and made a sign for me to cook some. I was afraid not to." "Oh, Charles, I was afraid." "You did the right thing," Pa told her. "We don't want to make any enemies with any Indians." And then he said, "Phew, what a smell!" "They wore fresh skunk skins," said Ma. "And that was all they wore." "Must have been thick while they were here," Pa said. "It was, Charles. We were short of cornmeal, too." "Oh, well, we have enough to hold out a while yet, and our meat is running all over the country. Don't worry, Caroline." "But they took all your tobacco." "Never mind," Pa said. "I'll get along without tobacco until I can make the trip to Independence. The main thing is to be on good terms with the Indians. We don't want to wake up some night with a band of the Screeching Dev." He stopped. Laura dreadfully wanted to know what he had been going to say, but Ma's lips were pressed together, and she shook a little shake of her head at Pa. "Come on, Mary and Laura," Pa said. "We'll skin that rabbit and dress the prairie hens while that cornbread bakes. Hurry, I'm hungry as a wolf." They sat on the woodpile in the wind and sunshine and watched Pa work with his hunting knife. The big rabbit was shot through the eye, and the prairie hens' heads were shot clean away. "They never knew what hit them," Pa said. That's a good shot, but we know this is fiction, so. But I guess you'd have to be a really good shot, especially with a muzzle loader. If your family's depending on the meat, you'd have to be a bloody good shot, right? Laura held the edge of the rabbit skin while Pa's keen knife ripped it off the rabbit meat. "I'll salt this skin and peg it out on the house wall to dry. It will make a warm fur cap for some little girl to wear next winter." But Laura could not forget the Indians. She said to Pa, if they had turned Jack loose, he would have eaten those Indians right up. Pa laid down the knife. "Did you girls even think of turning Jack loose?" he asked in a dreadful voice. Laura's head bowed down, and she whispered, "Yes, Pa." "After I told you not to," Pa said in a more dreadful voice. Laura couldn't speak, but Mary choked, "Yes, Pa." For a moment, Pa was silent. He sighed a long sigh like Ma's after the Indians went away. "After this," he said in a terrible voice, "you girls remember always to do as you're told. Don't you even think of disobeying me. Do you hear?" "Yes, Pa," Laura and Mary whispered. "Do you know what would have happened if you had turned Jack loose?" Pa asked. "No, Pa," they whispered. "He would have bitten those Indians," said Pa. "Then there would have been trouble." Bad trouble. Do you understand? I doubt they did, but just his tone of voice scared the crap out of them, no doubt. Sorry. Yes, Pa, they said, but they did not understand. Would they have killed Jack? Laura asked. Yes, and that's not all. You girls remember this. You do as you're told, no matter what happens. Yes, Pa, Laura said, and Mary said, yes, Pa. They were glad they had not turned Jack loose. Do as you're told, said Pa, and no harm will come to you. Back in the day, this is where children, were seen and not heard, and there's a really fine balance, because such strict obedience in the families back then, you know what I mean, gave way to the freakier parts of some people's natures. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't want to say it out loud. Such strict obedience allowed horrible things to happen in some families because they wouldn't speak out against their parents ever, or members of their family, or they would never disobey their father. You know what I mean? So there's a really fine line in the lives of children, that teaching them the importance of obedience, but also teaching them to have a personal voice. You know what I mean? Well, I've just done some reading on Pa. And you know what? You know when his birthday was? January 10th. He has the same birthday as me. But, I mean, when I look at the stories of Almanzo's family, right? And then I look at this man scooting his family all over God's green earth until the two eldest are 2 years late for starting school. Thank God she was a school teacher, right? But I mean, there are stories that, we're going to get into later on down the road, where he would just, make midnight leaves and take off, pack up the house and leave in the middle of the night. And you're going to hear lies all through stuff, because it is fictionalized parts of her life. All right? Fictionalized, made child friendly. You know what I mean? Oh, you never work in a hotel, really? So, yes, thank you, Jean. So, I mean, when it comes to, I was one of those parents who demanded strict obedience from my children. But then my children also knew that they had a voice, okay? I don't know if this is the actual place for this, but when my sons were born, I left them au naturel. You know what I mean, Jelly Bean? I figured if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Do you understand what I mean, ladies and gentlemen? So when they were old enough that they could have a bath, not even unsupervised, right? When they were like 2 and 3, I taught them how to properly bathe themselves to keep things clean. And the moment they could do it themselves, I said to them, and if there are any children listening, this is important. I said to them, this is your body. I'm not going to tell you everything I said to them, but this is your body. And now you know how to take care of it. Nobody has the right to touch you in any way that makes you uncomfortable. And you always, if anybody ever makes you feel comfortable, you tell mom or dad. Always. Always. Right? And still, because I grew up in a family where there was abuse, not in my personal immediate family, really, but more in the extended family. And that's one thing I wasn't sure how. There was a lot of mixed messages in my home growing up. right? So I taught my children that your body is your body and nobody has a right to do anything to it, not even doctors. Because I remember when my dad took me to the doctor after my mother died, I was getting buds, and the doctor checked them, and I slapped his hand. And he said, grow up. And my father looked at him and said, no, that's the way my daughter was taught. You should have asked her first. Right? But what am I saying, right? Exactly. Nobody has, and I taught my children that, and I was still so insecure because I was raised with so many mixed messages. I still didn't know if I did a good job. So when the kids got older, right? When the kids got older, I asked them, did I protect you? And they went, what are you talking about? Mom, we always had food in our bellies. We always had blankets on our beds. We always had, good Christmases. We knew you loved us. You and Dad loved us. What do you mean protect? And I said, I grew up, and I explained to them briefly, I grew up, knowing that family members in my family were molested. Right? And we weren't allowed to talk about it. So I want to know if I protected you enough. And they went, oh God, Mom, do you think anybody could touch us if we didn't want them to? Like, seriously, Mom, you taught us. So for that, I know I did that right. Right? Yeah, my dad was, but my mother was different. See? My mother was different. It was because I have no family on my father's side, and on my mother's side is where there was like 13 kids, and there was a lot of, my grandfather was not a nice man, and my grandmother was a loyal, strict Catholic. Diabetic, one of the very first batch of people in Canada to receive insulin. My grandmother on my mom's side. So I'm sorry if I went a little far on this, but I hope I didn't say anything inappropriate. Can you clarify that with me? Because, right? Let me know if I should make this unlisted. What do you think? And why am I not seeing any chat whatsoever? Okay. All right. Thank you. Talking these days, especially on the internet, not an easy job, is it? Not an easy job. All right. Thank you, Pammy. Thank you, Rennie, and D. Ari, and Jill V, and Helen 22. Wow! 26 people. All right. Well, love you all. I've got to go to my friend's house. We're going quilting. Wonderful. Goodbye, 1927. I don't understand. Oh, okay. All right. Listen. This is Bev from Reading with Beverly Wolfe. And I hope you guys enjoyed Little House Live Day 29. See you next Saturday for Little House Live Day 30. Take care. God bless. I love you guys. And thank you. Thank you.